Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Real Estate Shorts. I'm Alex Morkate, and in this episode we're going to talk about the future value. It's a time value of money concept and principle, and we're going to explore how it's important, how it's calculated, and how it's applied in the real estate context. Let's get started. So as always, first things first, what is it? It is an estimate of what you think a cash flow could be or will be at some point into the future. So this is very much a crystal ball type exercise where you are making your best guess based on assumptions, terms, to make an estimate for what could be into the future. So thankfully, oftentimes in real estate, it's a little bit easier than most people would come to expect, because these future value calculations are going to be based on some kind of contract or obligation or agreement. And I think the most prevalent example of this is the loan or the mortgage. And so we'll be exploring how these calculations take place within the context of a commercial real estate loan. So right out of the gate, I think how it's calculated is going to be the most important kind of topic. And I think for most folks, it's probably going to stem from a two-step process. So the first is going to be, how do you estimate the payment associated with the loan? And then the next is going to be, given that payment and the other known terms of the loan, calculate the future value. So one more time, keep in mind that the future value function is going to be the tool that we use to estimate the future value question. And the future value question may not always be called a future value question. It may come in the form of, how much loan do I have left to pay? Or when I sell, what is the remaining balance? So it may be disguised in the wording, but once you hear some of that terminology that makes a reference to something that occurs in the future on a loan, chances are good future value is the way to go. So in the example, I'm setting this up as almost that two-step process approach, where given these loan terms, let's estimate the payment. And then from these four loan terms, let's estimate the future value. So if you kind of step back and you remember all the time value of money calculations and processes, it's always going to be the same. You're given four assumptions and you need to calculate the missing fifth. So following that train of thought, we need to calculate future value, and we're only given three input assumptions. But you can use these three to calculate the missing fourth. So you can use the loan balance, the amortization term, and the interest rate to estimate the payment. And then given the loan balance, amortization term, interest rate, and payment, you can now solve for that future value. So let's walk through a quick example to illustrate how that would work. So in Excel, we're going to be using the FV function. If you're on a financial calculator, you would be using the FV key. But I would really recommend that you use a tool of some kind. Performing this math, especially in an iterative setting, is going to be a bit cumbersome if you try to do it longhand. So again, let's kind of outline some of these assumptions. You're going to borrow $800,000. The amortization term is 30 years, and you have a fixed interest rate for the life of this 30-year loan at 4.5%. So first things first, we have, what is that payment? So we calculate this payment in the same way that we calculate most others. Payment function, where we select the rate, we adjust for the monthly payment periods, so we're going to divide by 12, comma. We have the number of periods in which we need to repay this loan, 30 years. So again, keep in mind monthly payments, so we need to multiply by 12, comma. What's next is the present value. And so present value, whenever we talk about loans, is going to be a reference to the principal amount borrowed, or the initial loan amount that you borrowed. And then finally, zero for future value. So it will eventually get paid down to zero. That's the rule of the fully amortizing loan. So this will give us the monthly amount. So next question is, at what point in time do you want to estimate that future value? So in this case, we're saying 5 years from now. So at the end of the 5th year, what's the remaining loan balance? So that's why this 5 is here. And you'll see why it's important in a moment. So FV, and then we go through the same mechanics. So we'll say, what's the interest rate divided by 12? What's the term? Now this is an important point to keep in mind. The term in this case is a reference to how many periods have elapsed, how much time has gone by, how much into the future do you want to look, how far into the future do you want to go. So 5 years from now, 5 times 12, because again, we're looking at monthly periods, will give us 60 total periods that have elapsed since we originally borrowed the loan. From here, we continue to move forward. Payment, we just calculated, and present value, the initial $800,000. So when we press enter, we'll get this amount remaining, this amount left over. So 5 years from now, our original $800,000 amount borrowed will have $729,000 remaining left unpaid. So to prove the way that this works, what happens if 10 years go by? You would imagine that more of the principal amount has been repaid and the loan balance will be lower. So let's gut check. So 10 years go by. It's no longer 700 and change. Now it's $641,000. What if 15 years goes by? $529,000. What if 20 years goes by? And so on. So what about 30 years go by? So if all 30 years go by, then what does this mean? Now we've completely paid off the loan. And this should make sense. If it's a 30-year term, then at the end of the 30th year, we should have no loan balance remaining. So I think this is a great way to check to make sure that your math is right, your formula organization is right, where if you look at some point in the future, you come up with an estimate. But if you check it at the end of the amortization term, in this case 30 years, then you should come up with the zero amount. So how is this really applied? So I think future loan balances are applied in kind of two contexts. Obviously, you're trying to figure out what it's going to be at some point in the future, but maybe the circumstance is you're trying to refinance the loan at some point. You need to know how much is left. Or you're trying to figure out how much you can net in sales proceeds when you sell the property 5 or 10 years from now. You need to know how much to repay the bank first. And so the future value function will come into play. A quick side note, whenever we talk about interest-only loans, there's no amortization that takes place. So the future value is exactly equal to the original present value, the original principal amount that you borrowed. So in this example, we're using the exact same function, but because the payment was calculated based on an interest-only structure, there's no amortization that gets placed. There's no principal that gets reduced. And so the balance remains consistent throughout time. So again, just to kind of illustrate this point, if I were to say, sell the property 5 years from now, you would have to repay the bank $729,000 at the end of that 5th year. So some important considerations. So normally this is going to come into play again at some kind of capital event. So refinance, disposition, some kind of milestone event in the life of the property. Some errors that typically happen. So first is pay attention to time. So as we look at the amount of time that has gone by, just remember that that's really what this is a reference of. This is not how much time is left, it's how much time has gone by. So I'm not looking at 25 years remaining on the loan. I'm looking at 5 years that have elapsed since initially borrowing the loan. That's an important distinction because if you look at it from the other way around, we should use another function. The other is signs. So whenever you look at the amount that you've borrowed, if you have a positive amount borrowed, which you should think of it like that because it's cash into you, then you are going to be paying the lender. That's a cash outflow, and that amount should be negative. So watch what happens when we change the sign on the payment from negative to positive. Our future value balloons, because this is assuming that not only are we collecting $800,000, but we are also collecting $4,000 a month. So this is an important note, because if you don't pay attention to the signs, you'll end up finding that you owe more money than you originally borrowed. And under most circumstances, that doesn't necessarily make sense. So if you pay attention to the signs, then you'll logically conclude that you borrowed an amount and now you owe less because you've gradually been making principal payments throughout that period of time. So just keep that sign change in mind. And obviously the number of periods of elapsed rule. So as we go through this process, in this case, payment was already negative. So I did not make an adjustment to payment. But for whatever the reason, if you showed payment as being negative, so in this case, a negative of a negative becomes a positive, we would have to make the adjustment within the FV function so that we can calculate that future value appropriately. All right, so just to recap, what is the future value? So why do we use it in real estate? Really two main contexts. Whenever there's a major capital event, so refinance or sale, we're trying to estimate how much we would owe the lender at some point in time. We should keep in mind whether it is an interest only or an amortizing loan, but the FV function could serve us in both. You may have to go through multiple steps, like calculating the payment first to figure out future value. And as always, keep some of these quirks in mind, signs and timing, to make sure that you're calculating the end result appropriately. Hey everyone. To the point where all of the time has gone by. So when we have 100% of our time elapsed, then in this case, now we have. So as always, if you have any questions, comments, feedback, please let me know. There are a handful of other videos that I recommend you take a look at if you found this one helpful. Look forward to hearing from you soon. Take care.